Here's a bit on the basics of adverse possession, or adpos, as the cool kids say. Don't say that. You'll be ridiculed mercilessly. I want to discuss what it is, very generally, without getting into the elements, why we have it so that you get some context as to how it's meant to be applied, and then what the elements are. So what is it? Adverse possession is one of the subparts of property law. It's a subpart of the doctrine of possession, or it's mine. But it's one of the first things that you study in property because it lets you know who things belong to. A lot of other property law is basically derivative of possession. And now, this is adverse possession. If you sit on somebody's property long enough, it can become yours. Let me say that again. If you sit on somebody's property long enough, it can become yours. There are a lot of elements that get into that, very specific rules on how you can end up acquiring somebody else's property. Now, you may have a very good question is, why the hell would we allow this to happen? A couple good reasons. One is to quiet title. You might get a dispute. Let's say that we've got A trying to sell some land to B, and we've got Mongo. And Mongo says, land is mine. I own 50 years ago. It's not that easy to litigate something that took place 50 years ago. So the law allows us to say, look, this has been A's land for the last 30 years. B, it doesn't matter from his point of view who it actually belonged to before. He paid good money to A, and it should be his. Another theory as to why we have this kind of crazy law is to reward improvement. Let's say somebody's just got a lot of land. That dude who actually owns it does nothing with it. Then, say, A comes along and actually improves that land. There's a deeper philosophical notion that if you improve something, maybe it should be yours. The last reason that I think that we have adverse possession is just shits and giggles. Okay, so let's turn to the elements. The elements of adverse possession are basically as follows. Actual entry, you have to get onto the land. Open and notorious. Hostile, that is, your possession of the land is hostile to the true owner. Continuous, you have to possess the land without leaving it if you're going to take it from some other dude. And statutory common law period. Now, normally, this is like 20 years, the common law period, whereas statutory periods run from 5 to 21 years. Actual entry is a pretty basic element. You actually have to enter the land if you're going to occupy it. You can't just go around telling people that land is yours. Say this is you, and that's your index finger, and you're pointing at this dotted line, which is land. You go, that's my land right there. No. You need to actually be there. Yes. Next element, open and notorious. Your possession of the land needs to not be hidden. The point of this is just that you have to occupy the land very openly. This, where you occupy the land via a secret tunnel under the land and the actual owner can't see, that is a big That'll defeat adverse possession. The owner has to be able to tell that his land is being occupied. The next element is that possession has to be hostile, or as we say, adverse to the owner's interests. You can't have been invited onto the land. You can't be renting. You're not supposed to have permission. Now, different states require some sort of actual subjective mental intent, and they range from believing that the land is yours in some jurisdictions, and weirdly the opposite, believing that that land is not yours, but you're occupying it contrary to the interests of the owner. But for our purposes, and for the purposes of many jurisdictions, there's just an objective element here. You were not invited onto the land, and you're claiming ownership of the land. You don't say anything like, I'm just renting here, or I'm just passing through. Continuous is the element where you actually have to be present for the entire statutory period. Now, if it's a residential neighborhood, you can't just occupy the property on weekends and claim that it's yours. That's probably not enough. You can't openly abandon the property either. But the continuity of occupation can be relative to the property's use. And the specific example here is that if you've got a little vacation home, this is a lake that you only occupy on weekends, someone could adversely possess it by only taking it on weekends. So here's another recap. Continuous means that you can't abandon the property and that you're there continuously for the period that's relevant to that property. The last element is that you have to continuously occupy the property for the entire duration of the statutory common law period. And again, this can range from, as I said before, 20 years under the common law and 5 to 21 years generally under the statutory period. 10 is also a common period. So those are the elements, very basically. One last thing to mention is that what I've just described is adverse possession of real property. Now, there is such a thing as adverse possession of personal property, effects that can be transported and basically anything else that's not land. As you can imagine, it's simply easy to steal something, put it away, and then claim adverse possession, because unlike real property, which you can't hide, I mean, you could cover land with a tarp, but that's stupid. Personal property can be hidden away depending on the size of the object. And then you can just come out and claim like, oh, that was mine. So a lot of jurisdictions have gotten rid of adverse possession of personal property. So here's a question for you. What are the ambiguities in these elements that I've presented to you? That's a question that you'd want to ask yourself of a lot of the doctrines that you study, whether or not it's property, because in that is probably a lot of your tougher exam questions. Your professor is not setting up exams to help you just say, oh, okay, all I'm looking for is to tick off the 4 elements. The tougher exam questions and the way that you're going to get an A is to think carefully about what are the kind of facts that'll give rise to ambiguity. Now, here's one hint. Something that these elements haven't answered very directly is, what does an owner need to do to defeat adverse possession? A lot of jurisdictions say if you re-enter the land, that's enough to defeat adverse possession. You've reasserted control of the land, and that's it. What short of that might be enough to defeat adverse possession? Think about that, and we'll see you in the practice exams.